The Duke found his dead wife working as a cook, with a 6-year-old boy who had his eyes. The kitchen was alive with the quiet hum of labor, the clatter of copper pots echoing faintly against the stone walls. Steam curled from the simmering broth, wreathing the small room in a gauzy mist that softened the hard edges of the hearth and the faces of those who moved about it. At the center of this controlled chaos stood a woman, her posture rigid with restrained dignity, her hands skilled yet unassuming as they kneaded dough upon the wooden table. She was a creature of habits perfected through years of necessity, every gesture deliberate, every motion a silent testament to a life spent surviving without claim, without notice. Her name, for those who might care, was Mrs. Hale, though it was not the name she had been born to, nor the one she had loved. It was a borrowed identity, fashioned with care and caution, designed to keep her invisible within a society that delighted in the ruin of those who could not defend themselves. The servants whispered behind lowered lids and furtive glances, their tongues sharpening like knives when no master observed. She had become accustomed to the subtle barbs, the quiet jeers that followed her through the corridors, through the stew-scented rooms, through the quiet hours of early morning when the household was still wrapped in slumber. They noted her gait, the refinement she could not wholly disguise, the way her hands betrayed a life of better breeding. And though she bore it all with measured calm, her eyes, dark and cautious, flickered with a memory she did not dare share. Each whispered jest, each covert smirk, was a reminder that she was alone in this life, and yet, in her solitude, she carried a strength that was invisible to those who judged only what the eye could see. The clamor of the kitchen was interrupted abruptly by the sound of heavy boots on the stone floor. A hush fell over the room, a tension that vibrated in the air like the sudden stillness before a summer storm. She did not need to look up to know the presence that had entered. Her heart, trained by years of quiet terror and careful observation, recognized the shift immediately. The Duke had arrived. He came not as a guest nor as a family member. He came as the embodiment of power, authority, and the rigid demands of a society that could destroy or elevate a life with a single decree. He was tall, impeccably dressed, the very image of restraint and command. Every line of his posture spoke of discipline, every dark glance from his storm-gray eyes carried the weight of judgment, expectation, and unspoken history. For a moment, time seemed to narrow in that modest kitchen, compressing the years of absence, the silence of grief, the heavy burden of secrets into a single jagged instant. The Duke's gaze fell upon her, and in that instant, recognition struck as sharply as a blade. He had thought her lost to him, extinguished in the flames of a carriage accident that had claimed her from the world, or so the records declared. The papers, the testimonies, the obituaries, all had insisted upon her death. And yet, here she stood, flesh and blood, alive, defiant, and working with quiet skill in a place meant for the unseen and the undervalued. Shock gripped him first, followed by disbelief, and then a flood of emotions he had long trained himself to suppress. Longing, guilt, anger, and a longing that was at once painful and tender. She felt it before she allowed herself to acknowledge it. The subtle shift in the air, the barely perceptible intake of breath, the way the silence pressed around her as though the walls themselves leaned in to observe the meeting of past and present. Her hands, which had moved with unerring purpose moments before, faltered for a fraction of a second. Her eyes lifted, meeting his for the briefest of moments. In that gaze, 1,000 questions, 1,000 fears, 1,000 years of unspoken love and terror collided. She did not speak. Words were dangerous, unnecessary. He too remained silent, though the tension in his shoulders, the slight tightening of his jaw, betrayed the struggle within. In that instant, the kitchen became more than a room of labor. It became the locus of history, of private truth, and of a society's relentless judgment. The servants, oblivious to the full significance of the encounter, continued their duties with nervous efficiency. One spilled a pot of water, another nearly dropped a tray, and the echoes of their clumsiness only heightened the impossibility of the moment. Mrs. Hale, however, moved with deliberate composure, masking the rapid beating of her heart beneath the mask of competence she had cultivated through necessity. She could not allow herself the luxury of panic. The Duke's presence demanded that she navigate every gesture, every glance, with care. One misstep, one hint of recognition or emotion, could unravel years of careful concealment, exposing her to gossip, scandal, and danger she had narrowly escaped in her flight from London's society and her own family's intrigues. And then, as if the universe had conspired to deepen the Duke's astonishment, a child appeared. A small boy, no more than 6 years of age, ran in from the servants' yard, his energy unbound, his laughter ringing like silver bells against the stone walls. He halted abruptly at the sight of the strangers in the kitchen, and the Duke's gaze fell upon him. It was the eyes that struck first, the unmistakable gray, the precise tilt, the quiet intensity that mirrored the man's own. Recognition was immediate and undeniable. This child, this innocent and unknowing creature, carried within him the bloodline, the inheritance, and the living proof of a life that had been declared lost. The Duke's breath caught, his mind racing to reconcile the impossible reality before him. Mrs. Hale's heart sank further. She knew as well as he did, that the boy's presence could ignite scandal and invite inquiry. He was a living, breathing testament to truths that could not yet be safely revealed. And yet, as she watched the Duke absorb the child's features, she sensed a shift, a subtle, almost imperceptible softening in the rigid lines of his expression, a flicker of something between awe, recognition, and restrained longing. For a moment all pretense fell away. She was no longer merely a cook, no longer merely a survivor of misfortune. She was the center of a history that demanded attention, of a narrative that would not allow itself to be ignored. The child, sensing the weight of the silence, stepped closer to Mrs. Hale, holding her hand unconsciously as though to anchor himself in the face of forces he could not comprehend. The Duke's gaze followed the movement, lingering on the small hand, the tilt of the boy's head, the quiet intelligence in his eyes. It was impossible not to see the connection, impossible to deny the blood, the lineage, the history that had been hidden beneath years of careful deception. The tension in the room was palpable, an invisible thread stretching taut between the three of them, ready to snap with the slightest provocation. Yet even in this moment of potential revelation, there was restraint. The Duke did not step forward, did not speak her name, did not break the fragile equilibrium that hung between past and present. Mrs. Hale maintained her composure, guiding the child back to the table, arranging a small piece of bread for him with the precision of someone who understood that survival required careful management of appearances. The servants continued their tasks, unaware of the seismic shift that had occurred, and the kitchen, filled with the scent of stew and firelight, seemed at once ordinary and extraordinary. As the evening shadows lengthened, casting warm golden stripes across the stone floor, the Duke finally turned away, his mind racing with questions, recollections, and the gnawing realization that the life he had mourned was, in fact, still very much present. Mrs. Hale allowed herself the briefest sigh of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that this encounter was only the beginning, that the fragile veil of secrecy had been pierced, and that the forces of society, inheritance, and propriety would soon demand answers she was not yet ready to give. And so, the kitchen settled into a tense, uneasy quiet once more. The fire crackled, the pots clattered, the steam continued to rise in lazy spirals, and yet beneath it all, history had shifted. A Duke had returned. A wife thought dead had been found. And a boy, innocent and unknowing, held the key to a truth that would challenge the rules of family, society, and love itself. The stage was set, the stakes established, and the first notes of a story that would test hearts, reputations, and the endurance of love had been struck. It was, in every sense, an opening worthy of a lifetime of whispers, and the narrative was only just beginning. The first morning at Blackthorn Manor arrived under a pale gray sky that seeped through the tall, narrow windows, casting long shadows across the stone floors. Alexandra awoke to the low murmur of servants moving silently through the corridors, their footsteps cautious as though even the slightest noise might summon the wrath of the house's master. She dressed with meticulous care, her fingers brushing over silks and lace that now felt like armor against the cold, imposing walls that surrounded her. Each garment was a statement of survival, yet no gown could soften the chill that clung to her, nor the weight of the knowledge that she inhabited a home ruled by fear and reputation rather than warmth. Descending the grand staircase, Alexandra's eyes swept over the dimly lit hall, where ancestral portraits glared from gilded frames, eyes frozen in perpetual judgment. The Duke appeared at the far end, tall and immovable, as if carved from the same stone as the walls themselves. His coat was black, immaculate, the line of his shoulders rigid, his expression unreadable. He did not rise to greet her, nor did he offer the slightest warmth of acknowledgement. Instead, he said with measured formality, "Breakfast will be served in the dining hall. You need not expect conversation beyond necessity." Alexandra inclined her head, noting the faint tremor in her stomach that was quickly tempered by determination. She would not break, she vowed silently. Not yet. The dining hall was vast, the fireplace roaring weakly against the chill that seeped through the stone walls. Alexandra took her seat, the high-backed chair imposing as the Duke surveyed the table, his gaze unflinching. Each servant moved with silent precision, placing silver and china as though performing a ritual whose rules she could never hope to master. Conversation was sparse, curt, and Alexandra found herself speaking only when addressed directly, her voice steady despite the rapid flutter of her heart. The Duke's eyes, dark and unyielding, followed her in measured observation, noting her gestures, her posture, her restraint. She felt as if every movement was catalogued, judged, and weighed, a test she had not consented to but could not escape. After the brief meal, Alexandra retreated to her chamber, seeking solace in the familiar trappings of her belongings, small items transported from her London home as tokens of identity. Among them, she discovered a small silver brooch, delicate and engraved with the Blackthorn crest, placed atop her dressing table as though by invisible hands. Her fingers closed over it, curiosity and hesitation entwined. She asked the maid who attended her if the Duke had left it, but the woman's gaze shifted nervously. "His Grace has not gifted anything since the late Duchess passed, my lady," she whispered. Alexandra's heart quickened. A gesture, however small, hinted at a depth she had not yet been permitted to glimpse, and for a fleeting moment, the walls of her fear softened. The day progressed with measured routine, punctuated by the faint sound of distant carriage wheels and the rustle of leaves in the estate's gardens. Alexandra ventured into the hallways with careful observation, noting the silence that enveloped every corner and the watchful eyes of servants who seemed reluctant to meet hers. She imagined the Duke pacing in some distant wing, reviewing ledgers or correspondences, the weight of command etched upon every line of his posture. And yet, there was a subtle tension beneath the surface, a restrained energy that suggested more than mere indifference, a man carrying burdens invisible to all but the most perceptive gaze. By afternoon, a letter arrived, delivered with quiet discretion, its seal unbroken. Alexandra recognized the handwriting immediately, a former fiancé, the man who had abandoned her when her family fell to scandal. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal, reading the words that confirmed both abandonment and scorn. "I hear your husband has already forgotten you exist," the letter claimed. Anger, shame, and a flicker of sorrow battled within her, but she refused to allow tears to betray her composure. She drew a hand across her eyes and carried the letter to the hearth, casting it into the flames. The fire swallowed the paper with a hiss, leaving her alone with the acrid smoke and her racing thoughts. She would endure, she reminded herself. She must endure. Unbeknownst to her, the Duke had paused outside the library doorway, having seen the glow of the fire and caught a glimpse of her movements. His lips tightened imperceptibly, and his gaze softened ever so slightly, betraying a fleeting awareness of her struggle. He did not enter. The restraint that governed him would not allow intrusion upon a private moment. Yet even in silence, his presence was palpable, a shadow that pressed against her awareness without overt acknowledgement. Alexandra, unaware of the observation, felt only the weight of the house and the ghost of its fear-laden history pressing upon her. As dusk approached, the wind rose, rattling the window panes and sending a chill along the corridors. Alexandra wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved toward the gallery overlooking the estate's grounds. Rain began to fall, a steady drumming that mirrored the quickening of her pulse. The storm transformed the familiar landscape into a realm of shadows and motion, the garden paths glistening with wet sheen and the trees bending beneath the wind. Alexandra felt a strange kinship with the storm, both of them powerful and uncontrolled yet restrained by circumstance. The manor, so rigid and austere, seemed suddenly alive in the shifting patterns of light and shadow. Nightfall brought with it a tension that was almost tangible. Alexandra found herself in the drawing room, the firelight casting flickering shadows that danced across the high ceilings and gilded frames. She dared not speak, yet she could not sit in silence indefinitely. The storm outside seemed to mirror the tumult within her. The uncertainty, the fear, the flickering ember of curiosity that had begun to stir regarding the man she feared and loathed in equal measure. And then, from the far corridor, she heard it, a cry guttural and raw, unlike any sound she had imagined the Duke capable of. It was a voice broken by memory and torment, a man haunted by battles both foreign and intimate, a soul raw beneath the veneer of control. Alexandra's breath caught. She did not move immediately, fearing intrusion, yet the human sound, the stark, visceral acknowledgement of pain, drew her forward. She crept to the door and peered into the dimly lit hall. The Duke was there, hands clenched, eyes staring into the shadows as if the ghosts of his past had manifested in the very air around him. The sheer force of his vulnerability struck her, unraveling a thread of fear and replacing it with something far more dangerous: empathy. For the first time, Alexandra perceived that beneath the rigid, merciless exterior lay a man capable of suffering, a man shaped by losses that society had demanded he conceal. The realization was as terrifying as it was compelling. As midnight approached, Alexandra returned to her chamber, heart still racing, yet with a strange sense of anticipation. The storm had passed, leaving the ground slick and the air electric with the freshness of rain. She drew her curtains closed and settled near the hearth, the small silver brooch glinting faintly in the firelight. Her thoughts traced the day's discoveries, the letter, the quiet gesture of the token, the glimpse of humanity in the Duke's private anguish. She allowed herself a fragile hope, that perhaps the man she feared was more than the sum of his reputation, that the prison of her punishment might hold, somewhere within its stone walls, the possibility of understanding, connection, and, dare she think it, tenderness. The manor settled into uneasy quiet, the echoes of the storm fading into memory. Alexandra lay in bed, contemplating the uncertain days ahead, aware that each interaction, each glance, each whispered word would carry weight far beyond what she could yet comprehend. And as sleep approached, she held one thought with clarity: survival would require courage, patience, and observation, but it might also require the willingness to see beyond fear, to recognize the fragile humanity hidden behind the coldest of masks. Tomorrow she would meet the Duke again, and the journey of discovery, both terrifying and inevitable, would continue. The storm returned with sudden ferocity, rattling the manor windows and sending a relentless patter of rain against the stone walls. Lightning illuminated the vast hallways in brief, stark flashes, and Alexandra awoke with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs as if sensing that the night would hold revelations she could not yet name. The fire in her chamber flickered weakly, throwing shadows that danced along the high ceiling and across the tapestries, and she felt an irresistible pull toward the source of the turmoil, a sound that had disturbed her sleep. The Duke, not in composure but in raw, unguarded anguish. Drawn by instinct rather than reason, Alexandra moved silently through the hall, her slippers whispering against the polished floors, her breath shallow with apprehension. The Duke's chamber door was ajar, revealing the silhouette of the man she had so long feared. He stood rigid, hands clenched at his sides, and she glimpsed the trembling of his shoulders, the slight heaving of his chest, as though the weight of his memories pressed upon him more cruelly than the cold of the night. There was no pretense of control, no carefully maintained facade of indifference. In that moment, he was as human as any she had known, stripped bare by the invisible horrors that pursued him beyond the battlefield. A flicker of courage surged within Alexandra, mingled with compassion she could not deny. She stepped forward, her voice low and unassuming. "Your Grace." The words barely rose above the roar of the storm. The Duke's head jerked toward her, eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and hesitation. He did not speak at once. The rigid mask of command struggled to reassert itself, but failed under the weight of the moment. Alexandra, sensing the delicate balance between intrusion and care, inched closer, careful not to startle him further. "You need not bear it alone," she whispered, her words tentative yet resolute. He turned slowly, revealing a countenance that was both imposing and vulnerable. Shadows of his past seemed etched into every line of his face: the loss of comrades, the haunting of choices made on distant battlefields, the grief for a brother fallen under foreign skies. "It is easier to command fear than to endure grief," he admitted, his voice a brittle echo of the man London had long feared. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, now shimmered with a trace of despair, a silent plea for understanding that he did not know how to voice. Alexandra felt her own chest tighten, the terror of her marriage mingling with an unexpected empathy that threatened to dissolve the barriers she had so carefully constructed. She drew closer still, gently placing a hand upon his forearm, the warmth of her touch a stark contrast to the chill that clung to him. "I did not choose this marriage, and I understand what it means to be trapped," she murmured. "But fear need not consume us both. Allow me to share it, if only for a moment." The Duke's hand twitched reflexively, yet he did not withdraw. Instead, he let the contact linger, as though testing the possibility of connection, of trust, in a world that had offered him little but authority and solitude. The storm raged on, and in the dim glow of the fireplace he began to speak. Words long buried beneath layers of duty and reputation emerged in hesitant fragments. The betrayal of officers he had commanded, the death of his younger brother far from English soil, the cruel rumors that had haunted him since the passing of his first duchess. "They speak of cruelty," he said, voice trembling despite himself, "because they cannot comprehend the cost of loss. It is easier to be feared than mourn openly." Alexandra listened intently, each revelation a key that unlocked the hidden chambers of his heart. She began to see the man behind the legend of fear, the haunted soldier, the widower carrying invisible scars that had shaped every measured action and every silent glance. When silence settled, broken only by the drumming of rain, Alexandra allowed herself to speak of her own burden. She told him of her father's disgrace, of the scandal that had forced her into this union, and of the fear that had accompanied her from the first moment she had set foot in Blackthorn Manor. "I did not choose this life," she confessed softly, "yet I will endure it. Not for him, not for society, but for myself. And perhaps, in the endurance, there is a fragment of courage we may share." The Duke regarded her with eyes that had seemed impenetrable for so long, and for the first time, the faintest trace of admiration softened the austere angles of his face. Her words, simple yet profound, struck a chord that had remained silent beneath his calculated exterior. A tremor of something unfamiliar passed through him, a fleeting willingness to acknowledge warmth, to accept that human connection might exist even within the strict confines of duty and reputation. He lifted her hand with careful deliberation, placing a kiss upon the back of her fingers, an act at once reverent and intimate. "If you remain," he said quietly, "I will learn to be a man worthy of your courage." Alexandra's heart fluttered, a mixture of relief, anticipation, and burgeoning curiosity. In that small gesture she sensed the opening of a door long sealed, a fragile promise that the ice surrounding the Duke's heart might yet thaw under patient, steady light. They lingered near the fire, neither daring to break the delicate balance of proximity too quickly, yet both aware that the night had altered something irrevocably. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within the manor, a chaotic symphony that had revealed truths neither had spoken aloud. Alexandra realized that the man she had feared was capable of sorrow as deep as her own, that beneath the austere exterior lay a soul still capable of tenderness, restrained by duty and shadowed by past grief. And in turn, the Duke perceived her resilience and integrity, qualities that defied the humiliation and judgment of society, offering him the first glimpse of a companion who might understand, who might endure alongside him rather than crumble beneath his reputation. Hours passed unnoticed, and when dawn's first gray light seeped through the drapery, Alexandra withdrew to her chamber, her thoughts a mixture of awe, caution, and cautious hope. The Duke returned to his study, the weight of command and grief once again settling upon him, but with a new awareness, a recognition of the woman who had stood steadfast in the face of fear, who had ventured into his private anguish without retreat. Their unspoken understanding lingered in the air, a fragile thread connecting two isolated hearts, each wary but willing to explore the possibility of trust. By the following morning, the manor had regained its customary stillness, yet Alexandra sensed a subtle shift. The Duke's gaze lingered on her in brief, imperceptible moments, a slight alteration in tone, a question framed with more than mere politeness, a gesture that hinted at regard rather than command. It was as though the storm had stripped away the veneer of formality, revealing glimpses of humanity beneath the legend of fear. Alexandra, for her part, carried a new sense of agency, a recognition that while the marriage had been forced, the unfolding connection was a domain she could influence through observation, patience, and courage. The day concluded with a quiet walk through the rain-slicked gardens, Alexandra alone, contemplating the complexities of her situation. She traced her fingers along the wrought iron railing, noting the way the storm had transformed the familiar landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. Somewhere within the mansion, the Duke attended to his duties, yet she felt the lingering presence of his awareness, a reminder that even in silence, connection had been forged. And as she returned to her chamber that evening, the firelight reflecting softly on the walls, Alexandra understood that the night's revelations had altered the course of their relationship irrevocably, planting the seeds of trust and tentative affection that would grow in the days to come. The morning broke pale and silver over London, casting a fragile light upon streets still slick with dew. Alexandra Hawthorne adjusted the folds of her gown, her hands steady though her heart thrummed with anticipation. Today the Tun would witness her once feared, now subtly transformed presence, and the Duke of Blackthorn, who had once instilled terror with a mere glance, would accompany her through the public eye. The carriage ride to the city was silent save for the soft clip of hooves, the Duke sitting opposite her with a composed air, though she detected the faintest tension in his jaw and the way his gaze lingered on her hand. It was a quiet reassurance that spoke more than words could convey. He had chosen her, if only subtly, and the city would soon understand. The streets of London were already alive with early risers and gossiping merchants, yet when the carriage rounded into Piccadilly and the Tun began to gather, a hush fell upon the crowd. Alexandra's pulse quickened as eyes, previously sharp with judgment, now lingered with curiosity. The Duke's reputation had preceded him, and every whisper, every sideways glance, carried the weight of expectation and speculation. Yet Alexandra met the gaze of the observing assembly with measured grace, her shoulders straight, her chin lifted, the slight lift of her lips a signal that she too had endured, survived, and perhaps even prevailed. The Duke's presence beside her was imposing yet protective, and the subtle warmth she now sensed radiating from him contrasted sharply with the chill she had first encountered at Blackthorn Manor. At the winter charity ball, the grandeur of the hall was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished floors, silk and velvet brushing against one another with soft whispers, and the air carried the faint scent of roses and burning tallow. Alexandra's eyes scanned the room with care, noting both admirers and skeptics alike, while the Duke's posture remained precise, his hand occasionally brushing against hers in ways that were barely perceptible yet deliberate. Society's attention was drawn as always to the Duke, yet this time there was an undercurrent of something new. A tension, a curiosity, a recognition that the woman at his side was no mere passive figure but someone who had touched the unyielding core of his being. The culmination of the evening arrived quietly but powerfully. The Duke led Alexandra to the center of the hall, producing a small, delicate necklace of gold and sapphire, an heirloom from his late mother, a token that had not graced a lady's neck for decades. The room fell silent, the air taut with anticipation as he fastened the necklace around her throat with a reverent touch. Alexandra's breath caught, not from the beauty of the jewel but from the gravity of the gesture, the public acknowledgement of her worth, her presence, her transformation from a disgraced daughter to a woman capable of commanding the respect, and perhaps even the affection, of England's most feared widower. The murmur of the crowd shifted from curiosity to astonishment, and she could sense the subtle admiration creeping into previously skeptical faces. Later, in a quieter moment, Alexandra withdrew to the balcony overlooking the rain-kissed gardens, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. She sensed movement behind her and turned to find the Duke standing there, observing her with eyes softened by the earlier intimacy of private confessions and mutual understanding. For the first time, the Duke spoke words not of command, duty, or reputation, but of personal truth. I have lived much of my life in winters, each day colder than the last. Yet in your presence I feel warmth I never thought possible. You have endured what most would have fled, and in doing so, you have become indispensable to my life. Alexandra's chest swelled with emotion, a mixture of relief, pride, and tender affection. For the first time, she realized that the man she had feared was now the man she could not imagine life without. The evening was not without its challenges. A former suitor of Alexandra's, emboldened by rumors and bitterness, approached her in a secluded corridor, warning that the Duke could not truly feel love, that his reputation was a mask that would never permit genuine affection. Alexandra listened politely, but when the Duke appeared behind her, his presence commanding yet calm, the interloper faltered. The Duke's eyes, dark and resolute, fixed upon him, and he spoke with a quiet, devastating authority. Sir, the only presumption that risks scandal here is your own, the presumption that my wife would consider a man who abandoned her in her hour of need. The interloper retreated, silenced not by violence but by the force of dignity, respect, and the unspoken truth that Alexandra now held a power in his eyes that few could challenge. Later, as the ballroom emptied and the candles burned low, Alexandra and the Duke returned to Blackthorn Manor, the carriage ride quieter, filled with the subtle rhythm of unspoken understanding. In the familiar quiet of their home, Alexandra sensed a remarkable transformation. The stone walls of the manor, once oppressive, now felt tempered by possibility, the echoes of fear replaced by whispers of trust, affection, and companionship. The Duke, who had once ruled over her with distance and coldness, now approached her with care, his hands no longer instruments of command but of gentle regard. By the library fire, the final acknowledgement of their bond took place. The Duke lifted her hand, turning it over, and pressed a reverent kiss to her knuckles, a symbol of both respect and devotion. I have feared little in my life, he admitted softly, yet nothing terrifies me more than the thought of a world without you. Alexandra, her eyes glistening with quiet joy, reached to touch his cheek, feeling the warmth beneath the disciplined exterior that had once inspired terror. In that moment, the marriage that had begun as punishment transformed into a union forged through courage, empathy, and the slow, careful emergence of love. The following days unfolded with quiet contentment and subtle triumphs. Alexandra found her voice, navigating the intricate social expectations with confidence, and the Duke, once feared for his unyielding control, now revealed glimpses of the man beneath the armor, a man capable of laughter, tenderness, and admiration. Their gestures became language, a brush of fingers, a glance lingering just long enough to convey unspoken meaning, a smile that carried more weight than any declaration of society. Together they navigated the delicate balance of public observation and private intimacy, their connection deepening with every shared moment and every acknowledgement of vulnerability. At last, in the soft hours of evening, Alexandra allowed herself to breathe fully, releasing the tension she had carried for so long. The Duke, standing nearby, placed a hand upon her shoulder with a firmness that conveyed both protection and devotion. "You have changed the course of my life," he murmured, voice hushed yet powerful. "What began as punishment has become my salvation." Alexandra, her heart swelling with the realization of their journey, smiled for the first time without hesitation. The man she had feared, who had once seemed incapable of warmth, had become the only soul whose presence she craved, and she, in turn, had become the beacon of hope that had restored humanity to a life defined by duty and reputation. As night fell, the manor settled into a serene quiet, the storm outside long past, leaving behind the scent of rain and the subtle warmth of a home now filled with understanding and affection. Alexandra and the Duke, side by the dying embers of the library fire, allowed themselves a moment of stillness, each aware of the profound transformation that had taken place. Fear had been replaced by trust, coldness by tenderness, and isolation by intimacy. In the vast halls of Blackthorn Manor, in the shadows of London society, two hearts had found a rhythm and a purpose that neither circumstance nor scandal could diminish. And in that shared recognition, the story of a forced marriage transformed into a tale of enduring love reached its quiet, yet profoundly satisfying resolution.